Good afternoon and welcome to Cove. I'm Jennifer LaPlante. I'm the Executive Director of DeepSense, and I am very happy to invite you and have you join us on our third panel discussion on Mind the Gap, Technologies of Business Optimization for this panel series. Today, I'm joined by three great guests who all have background and experience and work in the cybersecurity area. And we're going to talk about how to protect your company, how to protect you, and whatever other topics that come up in conversation as we get going. I'm going to introduce you to everyone in a sec, but first, we have over 100 people who are joining us today online, so we encourage you to ask lots of questions. Don't wait for the first one to come through. You feel free to be the first one to submit one. And we have a chat function in the side, so flip it in there. If not, you can send an email to info@coveocean.com, and that will get an email through to us as well. For the conversation today, there's no presentations. We're full on just questions and discussion and dialogue. And please feel free, there's a YouTube link that will be shared afterwards, and this will be available online. Feel free to go back and watch and share with others that you think would really benefit. So let's meet our panelists. Today, we are joined by Matt Saunders. He's a partner with Cox & Palmer. Since joining Cox & Palmer, Matt has established himself as a unique leader in privacy law and data security. Matt is an experienced certified information privacy professional in Canada. So that's a CIPP/C apparently. Through the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And he works closely with local, national, and international clients to identify timely and cost-effective solutions for data breaches, ransomware attacks, and complex freedom of information requests. And that's a FOIPOP, which might end up coming up as a terminology that we'll have to go back and define later on today. In addition, Matt represents commercial clients in a range of disputes involving fraud investigations, insurance claims, and breaches of contract. Matt also writes and speaks frequently on privacy law and cybersecurity. And also I want to note too that Cox & Palmer is a proud supporter of Cove's Ocean Connector program, and they're very committed to doing their part to turning Atlantic Canada's vast ocean potential into a reality. So thank you for being here, Matt. Next, we have Jessica Han, and she's an accomplished CISSP and CISA. She holds a master's in communication and information systems, and currently she is a cybersecurity analyst with AceNet, where she leads the governance and policy working group of Compute Canada. And Compute Canada is a conglomerate of infrastructure systems that serve both academic institutions and private industry across Canada. Jessica has worked for IMP Group for 5 years as a security analyst since she came to Halifax as a new immigrant in 2014. Prior to that, she worked as a senior network engineer for MasterCard, Royal DSM, and Warner Enterprises in Shanghai. She also was an active volunteer and coach and mentor in communities where we want to encourage young students and children to start learning more and more about cybersecurity, which is fantastic. And last but not least is Brian Ronan. He leads Bulletproof's audit and compliance practice as part of the governance and risk compliance division. In his role, he engages with clients to assist them in validating and maintaining compliance against industry and regulatory standards and assessing client security configuration and supporting infrastructure security controls. He has 20 plus years experience in creating value from IT investments, managing high risk areas, and complying with IT standards. Prior to Bulletproof, Brian served as the IT risk advisory manager at EY, where he was responsible for providing strategic direction and oversight to the IT audit component of the company's financial audit functions. Brian has a long list of certifications that are a lot easier to read than to read out loud, but he's also a certified lead auditor for ISO 27001 and 27701 standards. So just know he's very skilled and talented at what he does. We'll have to share those later on, Brian, because there's lots of letters. So we're going to start first. We'll start with Matt, and we have a range of different questions we hope to get through, but please feel free to submit any online. But Matt, we'll start with you. You bring a unique experience, like everyone else that's joining us today, in cybersecurity. Can you describe a scenario that helps illustrate why companies should be caring about cybersecurity?
Certainly, Jen, and thanks for having me, and really looking forward to this panel discussion. I think scenario-wise, cybersecurity, it needs to be top of mind for organizations for a variety of reasons. The COVID-19 pandemic has only highlighted the dramatic rise and increase in cyber attacks, some of which are COVID specific, some of which are taking advantage of the fact that the pandemic has forced businesses in many instances to have its employees operate remotely. usually in environments that are much less secure. So that's certainly one scenario in terms of how the pandemic has certainly created efficiencies and streamlined operations from a remote work perspective. But the cybersecurity risks in terms of that evolution of day-to-day operations has dramatically increased. And companies are really playing a lot of catch-up in terms of trying to reinforce and strengthen their remote workers' cybersecurity measures, increase their awareness and understanding of the risks they may face at home, which are different than in the workplace. And I think the last point that I'll highlight is this is so important from a reputational perspective. And I'm sure we'll talk today about how cybersecurity breaches certainly have a bottom line impact. And in some instances that is significant. But the reputational harm that can come from an incident where an organization's not been prepared, it's not responded adequately, and now faces either liability from a dollars and cents perspective or even litigation perspective, that outward reputational harm can be even more damaging because who's to say an organization is going to want to engage your business if you can assure them that their data, their sensitive commercial information is as protected as possible.
That is fantastic. And so for those of you who are paying attention and listening to this, and we're going to come back to that, especially when it comes to things like contracting and different types of requirements. Moving over then to Jessica, can you share, you had years at IMP and then at AceNet now too. Can you help illustrate some of those reasons why companies should start thinking about cyber?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I worked both for industry companies and academia communities. So in my 5 years working at IMP, I led the secure projects, but not including but not limited to the security, firewalls, VPNs, email security, and application securities. Those implementations, which company cares much about how to control the security. And now, well, yes, I was also in incident response team and to handle all kinds of cybersecurity attacks and incidents. So 2 years ago, I joined AceNet, and now currently I am leading the governance and the policy working group in Computer Canada Federation. So there are difference between the environment I've worked in. AceNet is a nonprofit organization, and maybe most of our business in Atlantic here, we are experience the same issue with nonprofit organization. Why do we care about security? AceNet itself is a nonprofit organization, and we offer access to supercomputing resources, expertise, training, and support for large-scale analysis and modeling across a wide range of applications like machine learning, artificial intelligence, atomic and molecular simulations, drug design, material design, all kinds of this, medical images, so, and earth and ocean modeling as well. In addition to our large scale of supercomputing capacity, we have strong cybersecurity and system team here to manage and protect the computing clusters under the guidance of NIST cybersecurity framework and SCAP secure standard baseline profile. Why do we do this? Because we want to provide you researchers and developers a secure environment to ensure a secured supercomputing working place beyond the capabilities of your laptops. So why should industry companies, private companies, and academic communities care about cybersecurity? As you can see, why, this is all kinds of companies here, business here. So we started to care more and more about the cybersecurity because we have to. If we don't care about our business, our data, our R&D research results, and our efforts, somebody else will take care for us. The cyber attacks are always out there, so they will come in to take your data away and to take advantage of your researches. So if your data is important to you, they are attractive and important to others as well. If you don't do this, eventually you will be taken care of by attackers.
Those nefarious parties. So that's great to know. I think there's a lot of research that happens on Compute Canada and AceNet infrastructure. So knowing that as well secure is critical to make sure our research that we invest in as a country is well protected. Brian, you have a lot too from both, supporting companies from an IT security standpoint, as well as the audit side of things. Can you share a little about, some scenarios you've seen that reinforce why companies should care about cybersecurity?
Sure. So very similar to what Matt mentioned, where organizations have had to shift how they do work, and now people are starting to work from home. They're leaving that what may have once been a secure environment where their data is stored to now an unsecure backyard or a basement office, depending on what the case may be, introducing new risk. But at the same time, the landscape has changed that now where more people want to start collaborating and working with other groups or work with the government, for instance. And the onus is being put back on them to say, well, in this time of cyber threats, how are you protecting yourself? So I don't want to give you my data if you can't show me that you're going to safeguard my data with some level of rigor. So the request is now being put back onto these organizations to say, show us what you can do. And now they have to turn around and say, well, we know what we've been doing for years. We have all this institutionalized knowledge, but we've never written it down or documented it or undergone some form of formal review or audit to show compliance and to make sure that what we think is going to work will actually indeed work. And again, further to what Matt said, between legal issues or financial and reputational issues, you're going to be put in a situation where a compromise is going to impact you in more than one way, and in some cases could be catastrophic to your organization. When you look at something that Jessica said as well, the concept of the data, there used to be the opinion of my organization is so small, nobody's going to care about us, nobody wants our data. That was the case many years ago when the people who would hack your network required a lot of skill. There's a lot of low-level attacks now. You can take 15 minutes, search the internet, spend $5 or $10, and get an attack platform to do all sorts of low-level attacks in organizations that are in your town or your city. And it's not even so much critical research data. Every company has data that somebody can use, and that could be your personal HR data, because there's some identity fraud. There's a whole landscape for that. Or if you have an accounts payable system, you can, by gaining access to those systems, you can have low-level attacks that might just incorporate additional fraud. Like, well, I'm going to change a company's name so that when you go to pay their invoices, you're sending the money to my bank account and my address instead of the right one. So no data in your environment is inconsequential. Everything should be protected properly, and having good cyber hygiene will help do that.
That is fantastic. And in a little bit, we're going to get into how. But first, the question is really about what is the biggest risk. So you've talked about reputational risk and data, but maybe it's what's the biggest? What are the biggest? Because I think there's more than one, and you might all have the same one as your first, but let's try to see if we can come up with a couple others. So Matt, what would you say is one of the biggest risks that companies and industry need to be most concerned about?
I think it's internal. Certainly I guess the juicier stories are those of late involving significant data breaches of financial institutions, significant attacks on large commercial enterprises. But when you pull the layers back, in many instances, those cases have highlighted how really it's the internal lack of protocols, be it from onboard screening, a proper awareness and education when it comes to employee training. That to me is the, I guess, most practical and potential risk that faces organizations very small to very large. And it's arguably one of the easiest to deal with in the sense of, again, working your own internal policies and procedures to better train, improve cybersecurity awareness amongst your employees, be it via online remote-based webinars to, again, notifications and directives sent out to employees. But again, that really needs to be part and parcel of a culture of privacy that we advise our clients to really engage. And I see Jessica giving the thumbs up, but it may have those front end costs because it does require time and energy in engaging HR, engaging IT, engaging C-suite if you have one, engaging your vendors. To Brian's point about, you're only as secure as your weakest link. We would argue that could be your employee who clicks on that Amazon link that's actually a phishing scam, to your vendor who actually doesn't have a proper data breach policy in place, and they're dealing with your very sensitive information. But when you get those internal ducks in a row, the benefits that you can reap by being prepared for when things will go sideways you're in such a better position than, as we spoke about earlier, 12:01 on a Sunday morning, dealing with a call that everything is down, and you're getting emails from Eastern Europe on how many Bitcoin you have to pay to reaccess your systems. If you don't have your plans in place in advance of that situation, it's going to be a very, very tough hill to climb to respond to that type of incident.
And I think that your point earlier too, I think a few of you made it that it's not big companies that they go after too. So it's everyone needs to pay attention, and knowing that the people who are probably listening are more likely to be small and medium-sized enterprises. Jessica, what do you think would be one of those bigger ones, the bigger risks that they really need to think about?
Whoa, I really like Matt has mentioned about the security culture, the user awareness, all kinds of things. Yes, definitely. The internal culture and awareness education that's most important thing we need to do. Yes, risk for me is based on the nature of the business itself and the controls you have been deployed. So I would say the biggest risk for most companies is not knowing about their critical data and the threat which can most likely compromise their vulnerabilities. So they don't know what's going on behind or what's going on in the future. So what's the goal and the concern about your cybersecurity strategy if you don't have these ideas in your mind or in your team? So the best thing to do is to keep the attack surface as small as possible. In security culture, that's what Matt mentioned. It's not only important in technical. Yes, you mentioned that as well. And not in only in technical world. It's continuous user awareness, not only to users and to the C-levels as well. And this is the culture we are looking for. And training, always training to keep this in mind. And don't forget about you need to do multi-layers protection to your environment. There's never only one protection is enough.
I had to write down about keeping your attack layer as small as possible. I think that's fantastic and a great point. And I don't know if we'll get into the technical complexities of VPNs and different types of securities without getting too technical for our audience, but we might end up coming back to that later on when we explore some some specific what can people do. Brian, we're going to move to you in terms of your risk, but I just want to flag to those out there who are listening to flip through questions. Like, we have questions we know we're going to cover off that we can talk about, but if there's something specific that you're really looking to know, please share. But Brian, I think you have such a diverse background and long history in cyber. What do you think would be those biggest risks that companies face?
So, not to rehash what Matt and Jessica had said, but it is true. So, when the items that I've seen in my experience, it is your insider threat is your big threat, because these are the people that you trust, and that is a problem. Trust is not a control, and then conversely as well, you need to understand what is our important data. A lot of people don't know what is important to us and where is it. Especially when you get years and years into an organization, your data retention and classification may not exist. You may have things that you don't think are important, but you don't know where they are. And so as you start offloading some of that to, say, cloud, you need to understand, like, how are they protecting it? So people don't do that due diligence, and they sit there and they say, well, it's a cloud provider, they must have good controls in place, and they offload their data. But from the internal side too, and I see this in a lot of smaller organizations, everybody knows each other and everybody trusts each other. And the two big problems I see is that nobody wants to think that their employees will be bad purposely. So they don't want to set up controls or have an environment where I don't want my employee to think I'm spying on them. But you need to have these monitoring and logging controls in place so you can identify when things are going south on you. Without those, the employee just does what they want. And at the same time, you want your employees to be skeptical. For instance, the iTunes card scam. I've talked to 3 different customers, one of which was in the middle of an ISO 27001 audit, and they brought it up that it happened to them, and they got burned. Obviously, no detrimental issues to the employee. The employee wasn't fired or anything. This was how we brought our education into it. But when an employee sees an email from a respected colleague that they know, especially at a C-suite level, you're going to want them to question that and challenge that. And it's drilling that into your employee so they understand it. And it's not just, oh, I trust them. Why would the CFO lie? And then they go and they do the thing that they're not supposed to do. And the last thing I'd say from the internal side is the other demon is IT. They're the necessary evil. They're the people in your environment that have the keys to the kingdom that you cannot properly lock them down because they need that access. But at the same time, you need to have controls in place to wrangle them and control them, because they can cause significant problems, from sabotage to data exfiltration. You get a disgruntled network administrator, or a software developer, and you can have some significant issues. And we've seen that in the past.
I think many organizations, and I'm based out of Dalhousie, and I've definitely seen it flow through of those emails that come through under fake names and asking someone to pop in and buy those quick gift cards and other types of things, and the bad clicks. So yeah, it's amazing how creative some people can be when they're trying to get you to do something you shouldn't be. We're going to come eventually to the breaches and what happens. And Matt, I have lots of questions for you later on about data and privacy and changes in regulatory requirements. But first, let's touch, because we're the marine sector, this is the ocean sector. Some companies that would be listening today are hopefully going to be trying, or currently customers or suppliers, of the governments, and whether it's federal government or Department of National Defense. What are things that companies need to think about for complying with contracts with governments and other large, maybe large multinationals as well, that might have some similar requirements as it relates to cybersecurity?
Great question, Jen. And I think going back to one of our first points of discussion regarding scenarios. I think for those organizations that are dealing with, for example, highly sensitive information that is intriguing to government, that has national security implications rather, it's really important to look outwards and think who else may want this stuff. And by whom, I mean state actors. Either at the behest of the state very formally or with some level of deniability. We've seen multiple instances. The play that's unfolding with solar winds in the United States right now is example number one, arguably one of the most complex and comprehensive data breaches, cybersecurity breaches in history, with testimony, I think, given yesterday to suggest that there were at least 1,000 engineers involved in that operation. Quickly, I would just say from a scenario perspective, if you are operating and looking to do business with government and you are dealing with highly sensitive information, technology that may have security or national defense implications, consider the importance of cybersecurity measures to protect that information from going to another state. More on, I guess, the things to consider that maybe a little bit outside of the box and not top of mind for organizations that are now just starting to do business with government, federal or provincial. It's the importance of knowing your, I guess, access to information and disclosure potential for things that could go into a request for proposal submission, any other type of response document, even final contracts and documents that are, again, going to federal bodies or provincial bodies that fall under freedom of information or access to information legislation. Recognize the fact that some of your sensitive commercial information may be disclosable. It may be subject to an access to information request. And it's important to understand and know your rights under the legislation in advance of making those submissions. And if you are successful in a bid and you are working with a federal or provincial public body or even municipal public body, to know and to engage in good, as we call it, FOIPOP hygiene when it comes to your communications, your correspondence, how things can be properly labeled in an attempt to, again, shield or provide you with an argument that that information in question is not disclosable and exempt under the legislation. It's critical to, again, know your rights, know what could go out the door before you engage in those RFPs and or discussions with government bodies, because we see time and again those organizations, particularly from outside of the Atlantic region, who come to do business out east, which has a very transparent and very public disclosure focused piece of FOIPOP legislation, that they are more than surprised to see what could be disclosable after the fact. Again, another prime example on having that understanding in advance will pay dividends in the future.
And really quickly, in terms of that FOIPOP piece, FOIPOP is a provincial or a federal rule?
Two different sets, but similarly applied. So you'll have the Access to Information Act, which would apply to federal departments, ministries, organizations, and then the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act in Nova Scotia would apply to, again, government bodies. Interestingly, when I mentioned municipal bodies, the Municipal Government Act, Part 20, is almost verbatim similar to the provincial FOIPOP legislation. And so as a result, if you are engaging and working with perhaps a small municipality, you may still be subject to Freedom of Information legislation in Nova Scotia. And so again, it's just always important to look ahead, consider and weigh the costs and benefits of engaging public sector entities, but before you engage, know full well the potential disclosure of what could be very sensitive information.
I think that is a great takeaway for those listening today who might be engaging with governments, for sure. And Jessica, for you, in terms of your experiences both in private sector and then now in academic space, what do you think might be some of those things that from a federal contract or government contract company should think about?
Yeah, we do. We did have D&D contracts with INP. So, and now we are dealing with some sensitive data from some contractors. So yes, it's important. I think Matt have covered almost everything, But yes, by disclosing potential the information, we need to keep our mind always very clear what's the information you need to, you have your rights, right? For example, I've heard this story from a conference, secure conference. If the police come to you to ask for your password, do you give it or not? Actually, no. Why do you give the password to him? You can log into your system and give him the information you are subject to, but not the password. So that's the kind of what kind of information should be confidential to you and not even to your enforcement department or the legislation or the government, anyone. And then talking about the contract between private or academic and federal contracts. So it's very clear from the government contract for the regulations requirements and the compliance requirements. Those items will be very clearly listed, and you just have to follow. But yes, depends based on the different jurisdictions. I bet Matt know much about that. So yeah, and the other thing is we usually will be required to do the government security screening process to the individuals who works for these companies, small business or private or any kind of company. If you do this federal contract, yes, this is a required process, but it's there's levels of the screen forms, and so it's all based on the requirements in the contract, but lots of regulations out there with the federal government department. Yes.
It's a great point too. I forgot in terms of different types of clearances and requirements that people may have to be able to sign off for, that also sometimes ends up resulting in some people can't apply in some companies if you don't meet certain criteria, Canadian citizens and PRs and things like that. Brian, in terms of your experience too, and things that you've seen or experiences you've had with, you have a long history too in lottery and gaming, which is also has heavy regulatory requirements. So I'm sure when companies apply to work for a state-run lottery as well as a federal government, it'd be fairly consistent for some of those requirements. What do you think? What are some of the things that you would share with companies they need to consider?
So as you mentioned, for any kind of regulatory issue, there's usually some form of standard that body has determined an organization needs to adhere to. And what we've been seeing in the last 6 to 8 months, especially with government side, the United States government has put forth a new certification, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, or CMMC. And we have been starting to see Canadian organizations who do business with the US DoD or other portions of the government, and or have been asked to adhere to that in Canada as well. So this, as Jessica mentioned, this is one of those situations where you have multiple levels of maturity, and depending on the type of information that you're going to be handling or exchanging with the government, will determine to what degree you need to be secure or mature in this particular case. So you can look at some of the entry level ones where they're looking to see, look, we have 17 basic practices we need you to do. If you can demonstrate those, you're fine. Or you skip to maturity level 3, and then you're looking at 130 practices with evidence of an extremely mature program in place. So depending, again, as you start to venture out, deal with governments or dealing with other regulatory bodies, you're going to start seeing these little pushback to show that, prove to us that you have the right things in place. And again, the typical ones that we see are usually around the protection of information. So ISO 27001 for information security management. Most recently, 27701, which is the privacy information management extension to that, where that has a direct mapping to GDPR. So for those individuals who need to have some comfort that they're withholding or they're processing or collecting personal and private information for one area of the globe, that they have processes in place that can help them establish the same compliance in various other regions.
That's a great point. And one thing I do love when I visit British sites is I can opt out of my cookies. So there's some lovely little side perks that come with GDPR. But okay, that's great. And in terms of moving away then from government contracts, so this is assuming you're a well-established business maybe, and you've got lots of things going on, or maybe just starting out. Who knows? But what can companies who maybe don't have great bench strength in IT, or are a small team and are still trying to grow at their skill set, what is the bare minimum they should start building out for themselves? And so I think you might all end up covering different aspects, but compliance, privacy, legal accountability, customer relations, PR. Matt, what are some of those base level requirements you think companies should have as that checklist for them to cover off?
Well, somewhat selfishly, I may suggest and recommend that external legal advice is at least considered, or there's a number available to quickly call. And I in all seriousness, the reason being for me putting that suggestion out there is that in the event of a data breach or a cybersecurity incident that raises liability risks, that raises litigation risks, the reason why we recommend an external legal provider, lawyer, data breach coach by way of your cyber insurance provider, the reason why we advocate for that person to be the point person is you have a stronger argument that privilege, solicitor client or litigation or otherwise, then applies to the communications, the correspondence, and the report writing that will have to flow from the response to that type of incident. And so our advice to clients is engage that external legal party, that legal counsel, and then they are the go-to and go-between for engaging the forensic investigator, for engaging the crisis communications support staff, for providing the legal advice between all of those points of contact. Because again, if you are dealing with a breach that involves not necessarily personal information, but sensitive commercial information of, say, a client organization, that client organization is not going to be happy. More likely than not, they are going to suffer economic or some other type of damage that they may take you to court over. And if you haven't engaged legal counsel from the outset, it's far easier for your former client to say, I would like all of the information that resulted from that data breach to be produced over the course of discovery examinations or otherwise. And if you haven't had a lawyer involved from day one, it's very difficult to claim privilege over any of those documents. And we've had instances where clients have effectively engaged legal counsel, whether it's me or somebody else, too late in the game. And they're unfortunately very surprised to learn that forensic report A or crisis communications documents B are now potentially disclosable over the course of litigation simply because there's no privilege that attaches to them. So privilege can be a very, airy out there concept. But bottom line is we, again, strongly encourage legal counsel to be engaged to coordinate that full-on team of response because it is going to protect your organization down the road.
So now we know that Matt works a lot of weekends as he's dealing with crisis management.
Love those calls. Love those calls.
That's great. Really good advice. Again, these are things I keep writing lots down. I think, Jessica, your background too is software application too, like understanding the firewall, the ground level pieces of what needs to be protected. And I think the thing that's scary about cybersecurity, and if people have a gap in technology knowledge, you don't know what you don't know. And that's a problem. And so what are some of those things those companies should set up? What are some of those don't knows they should set up as a bare minimum for their company?
Yeah, I would strongly agree with Matt that when it comes to legal, yes, definitely. If you don't have a lawyer for your company, definitely go to Matt. Yes, we need a lawyer for those incident response to be involved. And the other thing is, if you don't have secure position in your company, and yes, to ask for professional consultant service, like what Brian mentioned about if you want to know what's your mature level, CMMC is the good option for this. But yes, we can do some self-assessment in our environment by ourselves with the basic benchmark list. That's every business or every individual we should do to know more about ourselves. Yes, it's scary to don't know what we don't know. So yeah, so for that self-assessment list, I would recommend at least what we usually use is to know how you identify the risks and how you want to protect your data and the systems by implementing security controls. It's all about how you detect the compromises and the vulnerabilities, and how you respond to the incidents, and how you recover your operations back from those incidents, and how you continuously monitor and audit your security controls. It's all about this list. Can be very simple or complicated, but it's all about what do you want to do and how it goes to the checklist. That's usually what we do for the self-assessment. And then you can go to your external resources, either lawyer or your consultant, to show them, yeah, this is what we have for now.
Excellent. And Brian, let's hear like the advice, the counsel you would give to your clients, to someone who phones you up and said, "Help me. Where do I start?"
Well, and that's the thing. So we don't want to promote the obvious, the bulletproof solution here as well. But we do. We offer a lot of those various things. Before I start, I just wanted to tack something on to what Matt said, and that's around the incident response thing. This particular component, I think, is important that companies understand, especially when it comes to things like data breaches or even being hacked, because you always see in the movies where people are like, "Oh, we're being hacked," and shut everything off,
right?
Which is not necessarily the best thing to do, because if you did need to do something, like if you were pressing charges, going to court, you lose a lot of that forensic evidence by powering the machine off. So having those discussions with somebody so they can provide you like a quick triage sheet before you call them of things that you can do or should do to help preserve as much evidence so you can stop the attack, recover your information, and take legal action against those people who have caused this damage to your company. So I think that's one of the important things. For us, because all organizations are different sizes, for those people who are new or they don't have IT, we like to at least push them in the direction of what a couple of different standards do is 20% of the controls to solve 80% of your threats. So really big bucket items, having good logical access controls in place, your physical controls, logging and monitoring, some simple perimeter defenses like having firewalls, using two-factor authentication, putting in VPNs. These types of things, they're easy to do. They're not always expensive, but they can help fight off the majority of the risk. They're not going to catch all your complicated threats, but they're going to stop the low-level attacks and the script kiddies and things like that. So having things like good patch management, making sure everybody's up to date on their patches, you don't have vulnerabilities sitting out there, and being aware of your environment, training and education. And not just this, well, we train them when they come on board. Great. 15 years down the road, they had that 15-year-old training, and they're like, what's email? We didn't have email when I started here. And those are the problems. They need to be brought up to speed and kept aware of what are our current threats. So those would be the things we'd tell them to do. don't be afraid to reach out to companies. Some of the services we offer can be quite pricey. I am free to admit that, but not everybody needs those types of services. Small consultation or having a virtual CISO or certified information security officer, somebody that you might only need them 15, 20 hours a year, but you have somebody on the phone that you can say, listen, I need your expert opinion, and they can provide you guidance, point you in the right direction, supply or provide you product names. There are lots of good tools out there that are cheap, some free if you're using other things that can help you. I learned yesterday, Microsoft has a compliance manager in some of their products where you can take a standard like CMMC or Cybersecurity Canada, push that into it, and it will tell you, here's where you're compliant, and here's what you need to do with our products to fill those gaps. So you have somewhat of an advisor that can help you, shore up your defenses. But I wouldn't take the approach of, I don't want to ask somebody because I don't want to either look like I don't know what I'm doing, or I think it's just going to be too expensive, I'm not going to waste my time. Even having somebody come in and just do a quick one-day walk around and assessment or a workshop, I think will instill a lot of confidence and show you where you need to fix things.
It's a great point, and I think you've all raised it, essentially saying it's a lot less expensive and less stressful and less impactful if you do it now than trying to fix it after the fact. So that's brilliant. We had a question that's come in from email, and the Cybersecurity Canada is part of this question. So they have 95% global clients. They've learned about cybersecurity, the certification. They understand ISED. Can you shed some light on how to prepare the process and qualify? No, sorry, I can't read it. The quality of end of product or level of certification. All right, so Brian, I'll pass to you first. Since you might be, I don't know how familiar everybody else is with the cybersecurity program, but can you give a bit of quick background and then maybe help answer this question?
Sure. So the Canadian government has formulated a new certification, the Cybersecurity Canada certification, and it's targeted at small to medium organizations, and it is essentially 13 baseline controls. It had eliminated the Cyber Essentials Canada program, which was run out of Cyber NB. So the two partnered, and these baseline controls, again, this is a good example. 20% of the controls to solve 80% of the problems. These controls focus on incident response, anti-malware, perimeter defenses. If you're using cloud, are you doing proper due diligence? And if you're outsourcing IT, the goal here is to provide an entry-level cyber secure posture that shows we are taking cybersecurity seriously, and we have put some controls in place to help safeguard our information. In terms of how to prepare, there's 4 certification bodies in Canada that are working with Cyber NB. We are one of them. And most of these certification bodies do provide some consultation. It can be, and the consultation can be tailored. You can have a workshop. You can hire us to physically work with you to develop the program. And at the same time, there's going to be some educational material from the government website in the coming months. I know that they're currently working on it, as well as templates for your documentation. The key in this particular certification is your documentation. The proper way to successfully navigate this is to have quality documentation that clearly outlines your controls. There's no operational effectiveness testing in this audit, so it is strictly looking to see that if you say we have 2-factor authentication, then there's some documentation we can read, some screenshots that show us, and that you're putting the best things in place. But this will cover all of those big bucket items that we talked about: training, logical, physical, It even goes as far as having point of sale terminals. There's a category in there for point of sale terminals and websites. And with your websites, it's really if you have any kind of website where a user interacts, login, etc., or you have classified, sensitive, or important information, we'll say, on that website, that it meets a certain level of security, which in this standard, they're looking to see that it would pass an OWASP top 10 vulnerability scan. And that would, the OWASP top 10 are basically your top 10 vulnerabilities that impact web applications. So cross-site scripting, buffer overflows, those types of things. I don't want to get, I can't tell how technical the audience is, so I don't want to speak over their heads or talk down to them. But this is definitely one where, I could talk all day on it. So this is something that if somebody did want to reach out, you could reach out to myself. Even on our website, the Bulletproof website, there's a section on Cybersecurity Canada, which does pump back through to me anyway. But it's not an onerous certification, and it's something that every organization can do. It's entry level, but it's doable. It doesn't require a huge capital investment or anything like that.
It sounds like it's a good framework and guidance. So it's great that they've heard about it, and hopefully more and more companies will be starting to learn and then recognize the value.
Yeah, I just want to, I guess, just one more addition to that. Sorry. Yeah. There was the government program that was providing funding assistance. It has ended, but I believe April 1st there'll be a new wave of that. So it's something that if you're interested in, try to reach out or try to find out from the government how to get involved in that. The most recent one, they were providing 25 hours of consultation for free, and they covered the cost of your certification audit as well. So we did see a large uptick in interest. If somebody's going to foot the bill, it's always good to get in on that. So definitely have a look-see as the new year starts.
Excellent. That's great advice. Thank you. And we, in the interest of time too, I want to make sure we cover off a couple of more things. So Matt, there's one of the big things for you is around the legal requirements for disclosures, for policy. Is there anything that you want to cover off that you didn't get a chance to talk about that people need to be aware about in terms of reporting breaches, or any other types of rules that are going to be changing, that evolve for Canadians, that Canadian companies need to know about?
Definitely, Jen. I'll just quickly mention that the legal landscape effectively around the world is changing dramatically and very, very quickly. And so if there's one key takeaway I'd recommend to those listening today, it's to pay close attention to what has already happened in Europe with GDPR, what is happening south of the border with a number of new state laws, particularly out of California, but we're seeing new legislation out of New York, Virginia, and Florida, all privacy related, and which we're hoping to see soon in Canada with the federal government's rollout of their update and upgrade of PIPEDA, which is the federal privacy legislation for the private sector. The new Digital Charter Implementation Act is broken into two parts, one for consumer privacy protection, one for a new tribunal that will hear regulatory disputes and investigations flowing from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. But I would just stress that the way in which these laws are changing is really twofold. One, they're moving towards a stronger focus on the rights of the individual, be it from a consumer protection perspective or even from a human right perspective. And so any organizations on the call dealing with personal information that may be sensitive, pay attention to how that landscape is changing, because the flip side of the coin, where the dramatic shift is also taking place, is when it comes to enforcement and regulatory fines. GDPR was sort of the gold standard. The proposed legislative changes in Canada will have significantly higher fines for instances where, for example, an organization has had a data breach and willfully engages in trying to cover it up or hampering an investigation. And we're talking in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that could be levied in the future. So pay attention to that landscape. And even if you don't engage in personal information, you're only engaged in sensitive information, security, commercial or otherwise, I would argue that the way in which the rules are changing for personal information effectively applies across the board. We're seeing that in basic contractual agreements. We're seeing GDPR language showing up in Canadian agreements. We're seeing reference to California legislation and privacy rights south of the border being a focus for commercial organizations here in Canada. So pay attention to that landscape because it is complex and it is rapidly evolving.
Now, really quickly too, in terms of a suggestion for where to learn about that, is there any suggestion that you have for sources of information that people should keep an eye on?
Definitely. The International Association of Privacy Professionals is a great resource. Many of its resources on its website are available without a membership, although I strongly recommend looking into getting a membership, particularly for those individuals who are keen on getting certification in either European data protection law, Canadian data protection law, American data protection law, and even on the more technical and ISO management side of things. The IAPP is a great resource, and it really is international. So you get a great flavor of both national and international resources to help you learn more about, as I said, how that landscape is evolving.
Amazing, thank you. And Brian and Jessica, one last question for you each as well. Do you have one recommendation of a location people can go to for information if they want to learn more about the things that you think are really important that we covered off today? Jessica?
Oh, yeah. I would recommend, yes, there are lots of places we can go to check the privacy regulations, like Matt mentioned, and the cybersecurity government. I do have a Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. That's very good for our business who is dealing with federal government to know about the Canadian government postures about cybersecurity things. Yeah, I can share the link to you later on, Jen, if it comes into email. And the other thing is, Brian mentioned about the cloud service. Yes, lots of our small business use cloud service and for developing for commercial website and it's a kind of this things. So think about the data location of your cloud service if you care about your data security. So look for more like local cloud, private cloud companies who can more secure your data in Canada, at least in Canada or in local storage locations. So we do have lots of local cloud providers in Computer Canada and AceNet. We can do some proof of concept for researchers and developers, but still any kind of service or cloud service you are using, please bear in mind data security is your responsibility and infrastructure security is provider security. So it's better to get to talk to the providers, but you don't get that service from AWS, from Microsoft Azure because they are big companies. So I would recommend our local business to talk more about local cloud providers.
That's a great point that we did cover off, is what happens when your data crosses borders and what rules you now face. So that's for another day. Really quickly then, Brian, do you have any last quick recommendations?
So for those, I would say, if you're new to it, I would start looking at large general areas of interest. So I would go the Canadian government's cybersecure area does have a lot of good articles, references out to standards and control documents that will help you learn what you should do and how to do that. As you get more mature in that, if you were looking at proper benchmarking or different types of certifications, then most of those organizations like the ISO, CMMC, they all have documentation that will help you perform proper risk assessments to determine, well, to what degree do I really need to? I don't want to go overboard here, but they'll help you do that. And then if you really want to stay abreast of things, I would look at some of those unique and individualized organizations like SANS to learn more about, what are the new threats that are arriving? What are these new vulnerabilities that are being discovered daily, and how may they impact me? And organizations like ISACA and maybe ISC squared, but these would be more technical, and these are the ones that they're going to get you into, elevating your IT to address those vulnerabilities and threats in a bigger way. But from an organization, start small, learn what you need to do, learn how best to do it, cost effective. You'll have to weigh that, what's it going to cost us, and the amount of effort to how much of a payoff is it actually going to be. There's no sense in spending a lot of money if you can do it cheaper and more effectively.
Well said. I want to thank all three of you so much for joining me today. This has been fantastic, and your expertise is something that I think a lot of us need to learn from. And a huge thank you to the team at Cove and Kyle, especially working behind the scenes to keep our technology going and bringing these sessions together. And thanks to all of you for joining. Please be sure to join us in 2 weeks on March 10th, and we're going to talk about the world of data, and we're going to be joined by experts from Ocean Sonics, Matters of Data, and X-Ocean. So Matt, Brian, and Jessica, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.